The rain hadn't stopped all night. Streetlights reflected off the wet asphalt as a single black car sat parked on the shoulder, engine off, hazard lights blinking quietly. Inside the car, the driver sat still, hands resting calmly on the steering wheel. No music, no movement, just silence. Red and blue lights suddenly flooded the scene. A police cruiser screeched to a stop behind the car. The driver didn't flinch, he waited. Officer Daniel stepped out, already irritated. His jaw was tight, his shoulders stiff, hand resting near his taser as if he'd been waiting for an excuse to use it. He approached the window fast, aggressive, shining his flashlight directly into the driver's face. "What are you doing sitting here?" The officer barked. The man turned his head, slowly, calm, almost relaxed. "I pulled over to take a call," he said evenly. Daniel scoffed. "You don't decide when you stop, I do." The man nodded slightly, keeping his hands visible. "Understood, officer." That calm tone only made things worse. "Step out of the vehicle," Daniels ordered. "I'm happy to," the man replied, "but I'd like to know why." "Don't question me," the officer snapped. Last warning. The man didn't argue. He shifted slightly in his seat, careful, deliberate. That's when it happened. Without another word, Officer Daniels raised his taser and fired it straight through the open window. The crack of electricity cut through the rain. The man's body locked up instantly. His hands jerked off the wheel as he slammed back against the seat. Breath ripped from his lungs. The taser wires dug into his chest as his head dropped forward, motionless. For a split second, the officer froze. Then he muttered, "Should have listened." The rain kept falling. The car's hazard lights kept blinking. But everything else felt dead silent. What the officer didn't know, what he couldn't possibly imagine in that moment, was that this wasn't just another traffic stop. This wasn't another name he'd forget by morning. Because the man he had just tased, without warning, without cause, was Steven Seagal. And before sunrise, this single decision would unravel his career, his freedom, and everything he thought power protected him from. This was the moment everything went wrong. Officer Daniels had been on the force long enough to believe the badge made him untouchable. Years of unanswered complaints and quiet warnings, buried in paperwork, had taught him one thing: nothing ever really happened to cops like him. He walked with that confidence, the kind that came from knowing people, backed down the moment they saw the uniform. This stretch of road was his territory. Late nights, empty streets, easy stops, he liked it that way. Less oversight, less noise, more control. He glanced back at the man slumped in the driver's seat, taser wires still stretched tight. The officer felt no rush, no urgency. In his mind, this was routine. Another, non-compliant driver who needed to be taught a lesson. "Dispatch." Daniel spoke into his radio casually. "Possible resistance. Subject not following commands." The words came easily. They always did. Inside the car, the man's breathing was shallow but steady. His eyes were open now, unfocused for a moment, then sharp again. He adjusted himself slowly, fighting through the lingering shock in his muscles. Even then, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. He didn't threaten. He simply sat there. Daniels noticed that calm, and it bothered him. Most people panicked after a taser hit. They cried, they begged, they apologized. This man didn't do any of that. He just looked back at the officer with a steady expression that wasn't fear and wasn't anger either. "Step out of the car." Daniels repeated, louder this time. "I will," the man said evenly, "as soon as you remove the wires." Daniels laughed. "You don't make requests." Backup sirens echoed faintly in the distance. Daniels felt that familiar surge of validation. Reinforcements meant witnesses who would write reports just like his. 2 more patrol cars pulled up, lights flashing. Officers stepped out, already forming opinions before asking questions. They saw a man in a car and a fellow officer claiming resistance. That was enough. "What's the problem?" one of them asked. He wouldn't comply. Daniels replied, "Got mouthy." The man finally spoke again. "That's not true." Daniels turned sharply. "See, still doing it." The other officers moved closer, hands on belts, eyes cold. No one asked why the taser was used. No one checked body cam angles yet. Procedure took a back seat to loyalty. The man slowly reached toward his pocket. "Don't move," Daniels shouted. "It's my phone," the man said calmly. "It's already recording." That word recording hung in the air for a brief second. Daniels felt a flicker of irritation but brushed it off. Videos could disappear. Reports mattered more. "Get him out," Daniels ordered. The door was yanked open. The man was pulled from the car, forced against the wet pavement, wrists cuffed tightly behind his back. Still, he didn't resist. As they lifted him up, he looked directly at Daniels and said quietly, "This didn't need to happen." Daniels smirked. Should have thought of that earlier. What Daniels still didn't realize was that this moment, this exact stop, this exact decision, was already being preserved backed up and watched by eyes far beyond this dark roadside, and the system he trusted so blindly was about to turn on him. The rain intensified as the officers stood over him, the red and blue lights pulsing against the wet road like a warning no one planned to heed. Steven was lifted from the pavement and pushed toward the back of a patrol car. His movements were slow, deliberate, not from resistance, but from the lingering shock still coursing through his muscles. Officer Daniels stayed close, narrating every step like he was already writing the report in his head. "Subject continues to be uncooperative," he said loudly, making sure the body cams picked it up. "That's not accurate," Steven replied, voice steady despite the pain. "I haven't resisted once." Daniels turned sharply. "You're still talking." The door of the patrol car was slammed open. Steven was shoved inside, his shoulder hitting the frame harder than necessary. The door closed with a metallic thud, sealing him into the backseat as rain streaked down the windows. Outside, Daniels gathered the other officers. He ignored commands, questioned the stop, and reached for something. Daniels said, "I perceived a threat." No one challenged him. One officer hesitated for half a second, glancing toward the car. He didn't really look. Daniels cut him off. "You want to explain that in front of internal affairs later." That ended the discussion. A notepad came out, a pen clicked. The narrative began to solidify. Inside the car, Steven shifted carefully, testing his wrists against the cuffs. Tight. Too tight. He took a slow breath, centering himself. Through the glass, he could see Daniels talking animatedly, reenacting the moment, exaggerating hand movements, shaping the story. Steven leaned forward slightly. "Officer," he called out calmly, "I'd like medical attention." Daniels walked over, crouched down to eye level and smiled thinly. "You should have thought about that before you acted tough." "I never did," Steven replied. "And you know it." That sentence struck a nerve. Daniels straightened up. "Add resisting arrest," he muttered to another officer, "and obstruction." The charges stacked quickly, each one heavier than the last. At the station, the atmosphere didn't improve. Steven was pulled from the car and marched inside. Boots echoed down the hallway. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Officers glanced up briefly, then away. Another late-night arrest. Another name that didn't matter. Daniels filled out paperwork with confidence, checking boxes without hesitation. Excessive force. No. Justified use of taser.
Yes.
Subject aggressive. Absolutely. Steven was placed in a holding room, cuffs finally removed but replaced with cold steel benches and a locked door. A medic glanced at him briefly, cleared him without real examination. "Can I make a call?" Steven asked. Daniels laughed softly. After processing, time passed. Minutes stretched. Steven sat quietly, eyes forward, listening. Then something shifted. A dispatcher paused mid-typing when Steven's information appeared on her screen. She leaned closer, squinting. Typed again, checked another database. Her posture changed. She stood up slowly and walked toward the supervisor's office without a word. Moments later, the room felt different. Conversations lowered. Doors opened and closed more carefully. Daniels noticed the change and frowned. "What's going on?" he asked. No one answered him. Steven looked up as footsteps approached from the hallway, measured, urgent, unfamiliar. A door opened somewhere down the line, followed by a voice that carried authority and tension. "Where is he?" someone demanded. For the first time that night, Officer Daniels felt a flicker of unease. Because the story he had written so confidently was about to be read by people who wouldn't accept it at face value. The holding area fell quiet in a way that had nothing to do with protocol. It was the kind of silence that came from uncertainty. Officers stopped joking. Keyboards paused mid-stroke. Even the humming fluorescent lights seemed louder than before. Officer Daniels noticed it immediately. He looked up from his paperwork and scanned the room. The dispatcher who had walked away earlier was now standing near the supervisor's office, arms crossed tightly, eyes fixed on the hallway. Two other officers had drifted closer, pretending to organize files while clearly waiting for something. Daniels frowned. "What's with everyone?" he asked. No one answered. A set of heavy doors opened at the far end of the station. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, measured, purposeful, not rushed but urgent enough to command attention. A man in a dark suit appeared first, followed by another, both carrying folders thick with documents. Behind them walked the police chief, not angry, not confused, pale. Every officer in the room straightened instinctively. "Where is he?" the chief asked, his voice low but tight. The supervisor pointed toward the holding room. "In there, sir." Daniel's stomach dropped slightly. The chief didn't look at him. Instead, he walked directly to the holding room door and stopped just short of opening it. One of the men in suits leaned in and whispered something. The chief nodded once, then turned to the supervisor, unlocked the door. The supervisor hesitated. "Sir, he hasn't been?" "Unlock," The door. The click of the lock echoed louder than it should have. The door opened, and Steven looked up calmly from the bench. He rose slowly to his feet, showing no aggression, no surprise, just quiet awareness. "Mr. Seagal," the chief said, clearing his throat. "I apologize for the delay." The room froze. Daniel's head snapped up. Wait, what? The name didn't register at first. It sounded familiar, but not in a way that mattered. Then the realization began to crawl in, slow and cold. "Mr. Seagal," Daniels repeated. "A's in him." One of the suited men stepped forward. "Yes, that Mr. Seagal." The chief turned toward Daniels for the first time. His eyes were sharp now. "Focus, officer," he said carefully. "Were you the arresting officer?" Daniels swallowed. "Yes, sir." He was non-compliant during a traffic stop. Steven didn't speak. He didn't need to. One of the suited men opened his folder and laid out a printed still image from a bodycam video on the desk. It showed the exact moment the taser fired, Steven seated, hands visible, no threat present. Another page followed. Then another. Backup footage, dashcam angles, timestamps, audio transcripts. This footage, the man said evenly, was already uploaded and backed up before you arrived at the station. Daniel's mouth went dry. The chief exhaled slowly. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "I followed procedure," Daniel said quickly. "I feared for my safety." The chief's jaw tightened. "You tased a compliant man through his car window." Silence. Steven finally spoke. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "I told you this didn't need to happen." Daniel stared at him, searching for arrogance, for anger, anything that would make this easier to swallow. There was none. The chief turned to the room. Everyone else stepped back. Officers moved without question. "This is no longer an internal matter," the chief continued. "This is a civil rights investigation." Daniel's breath caught. "Sir, come on. We can talk about this." "We are," the chief replied. "Just not the way you're used to." He nodded to the suited men. "They'll take it from here." As they approached Daniels, his confidence finally cracked. The badge that had protected him for years suddenly felt heavy. Useless. Steven was escorted out of the holding room, not in cuffs, but with quiet respect. As he passed Daniels, he paused for half a second. "You never asked who I was," Steven said softly. "You didn't need to. You just needed to do your job right." Then he walked away. And with that, the power in the room shifted completely, leaving Officer Daniels standing alone, realizing that everything he thought made him untouchable had just disappeared. The fallout began before the sun came up. By morning, the footage had already escaped the quiet walls of the station. Bodycam clips circulated among internal channels first, supervisors, legal teams, command staff, each viewing making the situation worse, not better. Every angle showed the same thing: a calm, compliant man seated in his car, hands visible, voice steady. No sudden movements, no threat, just a taser fired without warning. By noon, it was no longer contained. Local news picked it up first, then national outlets. The headlines spread fast, paired with a still image frozen at the exact moment the taser fired. Commentary followed: experts, former officers, civil rights attorneys, all saying the same thing in different ways. There was no justification. Officer Daniels was pulled from duty immediately. His weapon, badge, and access were confiscated in silence. No speeches, no explanations. Just a short directive and a long walk to the locker room. Fellow officers avoided eye contact as he passed. The loyalty he once relied on evaporated under the weight of undeniable evidence. Internal Affairs opened a formal investigation that same day. But it didn't stop there. Federal authorities stepped in. The incident was classified not as a simple misconduct case, but as a potential violation of civil rights under color of law. That distinction changed everything. What once might have ended in suspension or quiet resignation now carried prison time. Investigators pulled Officer Daniels' full record. What they found buried beneath years of reports told a story no one could ignore anymore. Excessive force complaints marked unsubstantiated. Traffic stops that escalated unnecessarily. Witness statements that contradicted official reports. Patterns that had been dismissed as coincidence suddenly aligned with precision. Each prior incident alone had been survivable. Together, they were damning. Daniels was called in for questioning. This time, he didn't sit behind a desk. He sat across from it. He tried confidence first, then defensiveness, then denial. "I was trained to control the situation," he said. "He questioned me. He didn't comply fast enough." The investigators didn't argue. They simply pressed play again and again. Every replay stripped another layer of certainty from his voice. The calm man in the video never changed. Daniel's actions did, escalating, aggressive, unnecessary. When asked why he wrote "resisting arrest," Daniels hesitated. "That's what it felt like," he muttered. "That's not what happened," the investigator replied. Charges were prepared carefully, methodically, without drama. Aggravated assault under color of law, false arrest, filing a false police report, civil rights violations. Each carried weight. Together, they added up to a possible sentence of up to 15 years. Daniel's lawyer tried damage control. Statements were drafted. Apologies were suggested. None of it mattered. The footage spoke louder than any explanation. Outside the legal storm, the department itself began to fracture. Officers who had quietly complained over the years now felt safe enough to speak. Anonymous statements turned into official ones. Training supervisors admitted corners had been cut. Oversight boards demanded answers. The department announced mandatory policy reviews, new training protocols, and external audits. Press conferences followed, carefully worded, cautious, heavy with regret. But none of it erased the image of that roadside stop. Steven never gave interviews. He never needed to. When asked for a statement, he released a short message through his legal team. "This isn't about punishment," it read. "It's about accountability. No one should be harmed for remaining calm." That message shifted the tone. Public anger turned into broader conversation. Discussions about power, restraint, and responsibility replaced speculation. Community meetings filled with voices that had been ignored before. For Officer Daniels, the waiting began. No badge, no cruiser, no authority. Just court dates, legal briefs, and the slow realization that the system he once trusted to protect him was now holding him accountable. The same calm he had mocked in others was nowhere to be found when the judge reviewed the charges. As the hearing date was set, one thing became clear to everyone watching. This wasn't a case that would quietly disappear. The consequences were real. The evidence was permanent, and the outcome, whatever it would be, was no longer in Officer Daniels' control. The interrogation room was colder than Officer Daniels expected. Not physically, though the air conditioning hummed relentlessly, but in the way it stripped comfort from the moment. The table was bare. The walls were blank. There was nowhere for confidence to lean, nowhere for authority to hide. Daniel sat alone at first, hands folded tightly, eyes fixed on the surface in front of him. The badge was gone, the uniform replaced by plain clothes that felt unfamiliar on his skin. Without the weight of gear on his belt, he felt exposed, smaller than he had in years. When the investigators entered, they didn't raise their voices. They didn't threaten him. They didn't need to. They simply began. They walked him through the night step by step, timestamps, commands, pauses. Every moment he thought he remembered clearly looked different under the unforgiving lens of recorded truth. Each time he tried to explain, the video contradicted him. Each time he justified his actions, the audio revealed his tone, sharp, impatient, dismissive. At one point, Daniels leaned back and exhaled shakily. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said quietly. "That's the problem," one investigator replied. "It never had to go anywhere at all." The phrase landed harder than any accusation. Later that day, Daniels was allowed a brief break. Alone again, he pressed his palms against his face and stayed there longer than necessary. For the first time since the arrest, the reality began to settle, not as anger, not as defiance, but as fear. He had always believed consequences were for other people. Across town, Steven sat in a quiet conference room meeting with his legal team. The atmosphere was different, measured, calm, deliberate. There was no celebration, no triumph, just discussion. "This could go very far," one attorney said carefully. "You'd be justified in pursuing maximum penalties." Steven nodded, listening, but said nothing for a moment. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes were thoughtful. "I don't want this to be about revenge," he finally said. "I want it to be about correction." The attorneys exchanged glances. Steven continued. "If this ends with one officer punished and nothing else changed, then nothing was really solved." That sentiment guided what followed. Instead of dramatic statements or emotional interviews, Steven requested meetings, quiet ones, with oversight boards, with training coordinators, with community representatives. He spoke plainly, without accusation, without performance. "I stayed calm," he told them, "not because I'm special, because that's what everyone is told to do. And it didn't protect me." That single truth reframed the conversation. Meanwhile, Daniel's legal situation worsened. Plea discussions began, but prosecutors were firm. The evidence was overwhelming. The charges reflected not just one act, but a pattern. In a later session, Daniels finally broke. His voice cracked as he spoke, no longer trying to sound confident. "I thought control meant dominance," he admitted. "I thought if I showed weakness, I'd lose authority." One of the investigators looked at him steadily. "Authority isn't taken," he said. "It's earned, and it's lost the moment it's abused." That night, Daniel sat in his apartment, surrounded by unopened mail and legal documents. The television played muted news coverage of the case. His case scrolling headlines he couldn't bring himself to read. Every familiar sound felt distant, as if he were watching his own life from the outside. He thought about the moment he fired the taser, How automatic it had felt, how justified. Now, stripped of noise and power, that moment echoed back at him with unbearable clarity. Weeks passed. The department announced reforms, mandatory de-escalation training, revised use of force policies, independent review processes. None of it happened quickly. None of it happened easily. But it happened. At a press briefing, Steven stood briefly at a podium. Cameras flashed. Microphones crowded forward. He raised a hand gently, signaling for quiet. "This isn't about me," he said calmly. "Never was. It's about the idea that respect should be automatic, not conditional, especially when someone is at their most vulnerable." He stepped away without taking questions. In court, Daniel stood before a judge who spoke plainly and without hostility. The law was explained. The charges were read. The path forward was clear. Daniels nodded as if he understood, though understanding felt like a heavy word now. As he was led out of the courtroom, he glanced once toward the gallery. Steven was there, seated quietly. Their eyes met briefly. There was no anger in Steven's expression, only resolve. That look stayed with Daniels longer than any sentence ever could, because it carried the weight of something he had ignored for too long. Responsibility, and the understanding that real power doesn't come from force, fear, or control, but from restraint, discipline, and respect for those who place their lives in your hands. The night that began with flashing lights and rain had ended in something far more lasting. A reckoning. Long after the courtrooms emptied and the headlines faded, the story continued to live where it mattered most, in the quiet reflections of people who saw themselves in that night. Not because of who was involved, but because of what it revealed. It revealed how thin the line can be between authority and abuse. On paper, the rules were clear. Stay calm. Keep your hands visible. Follow instructions. Trust the process. Those were the words repeated in every public safety message, every traffic stop guide, every reminder given to ordinary people. And that night, those rules were followed. Yet following them hadn't been enough. That realization unsettled people far more than any dramatic confrontation ever could. Because it forced an uncomfortable question into the opening. If calm obedience doesn't guarantee safety, then what does? The answer wasn't simple, and it wasn't comfortable. What became clear was that power, when left unchecked, doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it hides behind routine, behind habit, behind the belief that no one is watching closely enough to matter. Officer Daniels hadn't woken up that night planning to destroy his life. He hadn't seen himself as cruel or unjust. In his mind, he was enforcing order, maintaining control, doing what he believed authority required. That belief was the real danger. Because when authority becomes tied to ego, every question feels like a challenge. Every calm voice feels like defiance, and every situation becomes something to dominate rather than manage. The most chilling part wasn't the taser itself. It was how easy it was. One decision, one trigger pull, one moment of impatience. And suddenly, a life changed course forever. For Steven, the lesson wasn't about survival or status. It was about visibility. About how many people had been through similar moments without cameras, without witnesses, without the ability to be heard afterward. That was why he refused to turn the moment into spectacle. No victory lap. No public shaming. Just a quiet insistence on accountability and change. Because punishment alone doesn't fix systems, awareness does. The reforms that followed weren't perfect. No reform ever is. But they existed because a line had been crossed in full view, impossible to deny. Training shifted its focus. Conversations changed tone. People began asking not just whether force was legal, but whether it was necessary. And for many watching, that shift mattered. It mattered to the driver who now checks that their phone is recording before pulling over. It mattered to the officer who hesitates an extra second before escalating. It mattered to the families who had learned, the hard way, how quickly trust can break. Respect, the story reminded everyone, isn't something you demand. It's something you demonstrate, especially when you hold power over someone else. Real strength isn't loud. Real authority doesn't need intimidation. And real justice doesn't rush to protect itself at the cost of truth. In the end, this wasn't a story about a famous name or a dramatic downfall. It was about a moment that could have happened to anyone. A moment that exposed how systems work when no one expects consequences, and how they change when consequences become unavoidable. The night started with flashing lights and rain. It ended with a question that lingered far longer than the sirens ever did. What kind of power do we tolerate and why? That question is still being answered, one policy, one conversation, one choice at a time. And stories like this matter not because they shock us, but because they remind us to pay attention, to question, to hold both ourselves and those in authority to the same standard we expect from everyone else. Because silence doesn't maintain order, it maintains patterns. And patterns only change when someone is willing to say, "This isn't right." More stories like this are coming, stories that explore accountability, restraint, and the moments that redefine lives in ways no one expects. If this one stayed with you, let us know which part hit the hardest. Your feedback helps shape what comes next, and if there's one thing to carry forward from this story, let it be this. Calm isn't weakness, respect isn't optional, and true power is proven by how carefully it's used. Thank you for watching, and for staying engaged until the end.